Here I'm going to cover how does Manta work. Um, at high level, we hear a lot of oftentimes, even within IBM, people talk about data lineage, right? So the data lineage, we need to keep in mind the context of the data lineage we are talking about. If we were talking about the data lineage in the context of data band, right? This is where data is in movement. So we create a data integration pipeline where each step involves certain operation against a data set, right? If the underlying operation had for some reason had failed, it will have some implication on the associated data set, and the downstream operation will get impact. So if we were talking about data lineage in the context of data ingestion pipeline, then the data lineage is really the implication where due to certain failure in the upstream step, right, it's cascading down to the downstream system. So that's the data lineage if we were talking about in a setting of data integration. But Manta data lineage is very different. If you take a look at the architecture diagram, right, and the bottom layer is basically the source system Manta can connect to. So traditionally, database system, right, data warehouse, and some data modeling tool, and also ETL tool or ELT tools. So this doesn't necessarily mean only IBM data stage, right? It can connect to Talent, Informatica, and even open source Spark engine. So those are considered the main competitor in the ETL space against IBM. And also Manta can connect to some reporting tools and other systems. So what happens if you're interested in connecting to a system where Manta doesn't support, right? So basically there's an open Manta framework let you define the connection against a not support system. Erica mentioned, the .NET application TCS is interested in earlier, right? So out of box, we don't provide a direct connector to the .NET application, but through the Open Manta framework, basically we can use some GUI to create a connection. And then once we have the connection in place, right, Manta, it really goes about this by different scenario. I will explain what we mean by a different scenario, right? So what happens if I'm extracting data from a source database, go through some ETL process, and eventually bring the data down to a BI report. So this will be one integration process, right? So this is where we define the scope of the metadata, where I'm going to the source and the target, and the transformation happen in between, right? So this is basically the scope of the Manta. And the lineage information Manta takes is really a point of time. So that's why, in the upcoming demo session, you're going to see, where I'm talking about a revision, right? A revision is basically a point of time kind of snapshot of the Manta of the underlying data lineage information associated with the source system and the target system. And over time, of course, the ETL job can change, the schema can change, right? And then there will be something called a minor revision. So basically, a revision is basically a point of time kind of information. And why are we taking the data lineage? Why data lineage is important? This is where I'm going to talk about, from a data privacy perspective, from a data quality perspective, and even from a data integration perspective, right? We all rely on the lineage information, right? Where is the source data coming from, and what kind of transformation has happened against the underlying data set? Is there any PI data? What is the data quality, right? So those really plays very important role feeding the information if we were to, find out data privacy, data quality. And the IKC is basically not the only data catalog Manta can be integrated to, right? So from a go-to-market perspective, there's a lot of different competition in the marketplace. And IBM Knowledge Catalog is not the only solution from a catalog perspective, right? So there's offering from, Informatica, there will be offering from other vendor, which from a point product perspective, from the Ghana study, right, they're really in a leadership position. So Manta is basically the data catalog agnostic, can be integrated with a lot of different vendors, including some of our major competitors. So that's why it's really very important. On the next slide, please. So basically, this is a high-level diagram on the lineage information. So basically, we are extracting data from the MS SQL database, right? It went through some kind of transformation. As you can see here, if I were to highlight on a particular column, right, it will show, the upstream, where the data is coming from, the upstream column, and also cascading down to the downstream system. Keep in mind, unlike database, right, Manta only captured the metadata and never captured the data itself. So when we are talking about data lineage from a Manta perspective, right, we are only talking about capturing the metadata, not the real data set. If there's a data ingestion pipeline where certain operation is happening against the underlying data set, right? And from that perspective, have understanding on the underlying data set, the real data is really important because, it can have some implication to the downstream operation. But from Manta perspective, we only care about the metadata. The next slide, please. So here I'm talking about, the zooming in one level down, right? So on the left-hand side is the source system where Manta can connect to. And here on the middle is basically the Manta instance, right? And you can see there's the Manta server as well as the Open Manta framework. The Open Manta is basically let you define a custom connector against some data source where there's no out-of-box connector have been provided. And inside the Manta server, right, we hear the word scan. Basically, a scan really consists of two parts. The first part is basically extracting data, the metadata, from the source system as well as the target system, right? We need to understand what kind of metadata we are dealing with. And then the second piece is the analyzer. So the analyzer is really doing the heavy lifting. It's kind of figure out what kind of transformation happen against the underlying data, right? Basically, based on the combination of the extractor and the analyzer, we are going to populate a graph database. So basically, that's the Janus graph database, right? So the diagram you saw earlier is basically coming from the Janus graph database. And then there's also a data flow analyzer. So basically, I'm going to quickly demo on that a little bit later. And on the right-hand side, basically, you can see there's the admin UI. So basically, this is where you do, you set up the connection, you set up the workflow, right? And then the flow viewer is basically the piece giving you the graphical representation of the lineage information. And all those can be, a downstream system can using API kind of query the graph database, get the lineage information. The next slide, please. This is basically give you another 10-foot view of the overall architecture. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I'm going to concentrate on the left-hand side. The right-hand side, right? So basically, those are the downstream consumer for the Manta. So that's why, from a go-to-market perspective, this is really very important, right? IBM is not basically the only data catalog vendor. There's a number of other data catalog vendor, including, Informatica, Calibre, right? Calibre is basically considered the leader in the data catalog space. So Manta basically offers out-of-box integration with those data catalog too. So if you have any service partner, right, they're heavy in the data integration space, not necessarily on the data stage, right? They can use our competitor offering like Informatica or Talent, right? And they can use a data catalog from Calibre. Manta can still play an important role. And from a deployment perspective, right, Manta can be sold as a cartridge for the Compact for data, but it can be also sold as standalone offering, which makes it really very attractive. If there's any service partner in the data integration space, they truly care about, bringing some additional value on top their ETL solution, right? So this is where Manta fits in perfectly, as you can see in this example. Now I'm going to quickly switch to a demo environment.